Hey everybody, it's Dr. Claw here with an explanation of the comparative paper for monsters in early British literature. So I'm making this screencast during fall of 2019, and the suggested due date is November 26th. That's the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. And the length for this one is 1,800 words, so it's a little bit longer than the close reading paper. However, exciting! You can use your original text from your close reading paper, and you can actually use your whole close reading paper. So let me give you an overview of this paper and how it's supposed to work. So you did your close reading paper where you looked very closely at one text from our syllabus. And in the comparative paper, you're going to bring one more text in. If you're really adamant about it, you can bring two more texts in. But I normally recommend choosing one new text and then using the text that you chose for the close reading paper. So one text you're already an expert in, you've already written a whole paper on it. You'll just bring in one new one. And you can also use the content of your close reading paper. And I'm going to talk more about that as we look through the prompts. But for now, let's just kind of go over what this paper will look like. So as I said, it should be about 1,800 words, which is about 6 pages. This is longer because you're going to be talking about more texts. You just need more space to be able to talk about 2 texts instead of just one. Keep in mind that if you want to do the rough draft, you will need to submit that by Friday, November 15th. Like the other rough draft assignment, the purpose of it is for you to turn it in early enough so that you can get feedback that you can apply to the final draft. So that's why there's a cutoff date for the rough draft. And that rough draft should be 1,400 words. As always, I'm grading those on effort. So show me that you are trying to write your paper and you're working through the argument in some way, and you are likely to get full credit for that. Okay, so the final draft of your comparative paper is 275,000 points, which is a huge amount of points. So if you've been stressed about your point totals, this is a great way to really bump that total up. It'll be the same as the close reading paper in terms of I expect it to be very polished and well proofread. You should use MLA format for all of your citations. You should include citations, and it should be color coded just like the analytical paragraph and just like the close reading paper. Okay, so let's jump down to the prompts. What you'll see as you look at the comparative paper is that a big chunk of the prompt will look exactly like the one that you did for the close reading paper. And this is how I'm working this paper so that you can use as much as possible of your close reading paper in your comparative paper. And so let's take the first prompt as an example. So you'll use the work on monsters that you developed in your close reading paper. So you've already made some kind of argument about monsters and a larger concept in your close reading paper. And now in this paper, you are going to identify patterns that you can discover. And this is really the goal of comparison. When you are writing a comparison, you're trying to look for patterns. What similarities or differences can you discover when you put these two texts next to each other and ask the same questions about these texts? So the benefit here in the comparative paper is that you already have a really clear sense of the types of questions that you want to ask because you've already worked through those in your close reading paper. So the new work you do in the comparative paper is you're applying those questions and that lens you took to a new text that you haven't yet looked at. So that will be some new close reading content that you have right there. The second new portion of the comparative paper will be the section where you actually conduct the comparison. So if you think about it, you did a close reading of text 1, that was in your close reading paper. Then you're going to do a close reading of text 2, that will be your new text that you're pulling in for the comparative paper. And then you'll need a third section where you explain what you can learn by comparing your analysis of both of these texts. So pretty much all of the comparative papers will have at least 3 parts. 1 part per text, assuming you're doing 2 texts, and then 1 part that compares your analysis of those 2 texts. Okay, so the prompts are pretty much the same. I have added in more information that helps guide you through the comparison process. As you can see, you can use 2 to 3 texts. I do recommend using 2 texts rather than 3, simply because if you use 2 texts, you're more likely to go into greater depth, which results in higher quality writing. However, if you see some amazing connection between 3 of the texts and you just have to write about all 3 of them, you can do that. All right, so for prompt 1, you're going to identify the larger concept that each text reveals. Now, ideally, you have chosen a second text that works well with the larger concept that you chose for your first text. So you'll answer the questions in the prompt about both texts, and these are the same questions from the close reading paper. So you've already answered these questions for one of the texts, but you'll answer them for the first time for your new text. And then for each of the prompts, the third little paragraph there, or the last paragraph, will be one that walks you through the comparison itself. So this is what you use when you're writing your third section of your paper. What can you learn when you compare the way each of these texts uses monsters to discuss this larger concept? What are the similarities? What are the differences? And what can you learn about the types of things monsters let a text reveal or discuss? So this, especially this last question right here, is really asking you what you've learned from comparing your 2 texts. And it's important that you do actually ask yourself that question. That's really the purpose of a comparative paper, and that's why a comparative paper can help you conduct a kind of bigger analysis than a single text close reading paper. Okay, so the other prompts will be pretty much the same. And what I did, since these prompts are pretty big at this point, is I put 1 prompt per page. I know I benefit when I can see some white space around the writing that I'm looking at. So that's what I've done here. So don't stress if you're working on prompt 3 or something and you're sitting here looking at 2 and you're like, oh my gosh, it's gone. No, it's just 1 page down. So prompt 2 is the fantasy prompt, same thing as before. The original questions from the first paper prompt are here, and then I've given you some instructions for the comparative portion of your text for this one. Consider what your analysis has revealed about the benefits and capabilities of fantasy in a text. Now, I didn't write this here, but you can also talk about the drawbacks of using fantasy in a text. However, since this prompt is very much about kind of what unique things does fantasy allow an author to do, the drawbacks are going to be less relevant probably. But that's not to say you can't mention them. Okay, in prompt 3, this is the prompt about how a text defines humanity, and it uses that excerpt from the Clemson Library edition of Frankenstein. It's like for scientists and engineers. And so this is asking about the man as a sensitive and rational animal. So same questions as before. How do we define personhood today? And can personhood include non-rational animals? Now here, for some reason, I put the comparative instructions in the middle. So I apologize for that. But now you know that that's where they are. So you should be fine. So once you're ready to compare, do the text agree in their definition of humanity? They're probably not going to. And that's what's so interesting about this question, and so interesting about when texts try to answer it. You know, what makes a human, and what makes something not count as a human. Most of these texts are going to have different answers, and that's where the comparison gets exciting in this prompt. What are the common factors? And if they disagree, what can you learn from the differences? And this prompt also invites you to think about what problems can you spot when you're trying to define humanity. Okay, and then finally we have the prompt on monstrosity and morality. So here you are going to answer the questions about the correlation a text depicts between monstrosity and morality. You will provide examples of the text depicting a character or characters as monstrous, and you'll provide examples of how the text suggests that these characters are immoral as well. And then I just moved some of the comparative information around, but the comparative questions are up here in this prompt. So do the texts agree in the relationship they establish between monstrosity and morality? What are the common factors? If they disagree, what can you learn from the differences? So these are very similar questions to those in prompt 3. And a final suggestion I have here. As you're comparing and looking at those patterns, consider what your analysis has revealed about the problems with defining monstrosity using morality. So pretty much all of these comparisons invite you to look for patterns, but also look for ways in which maybe there isn't an exact correlation or there's some kind of breakdown. And as always, I invite you to really dig into those conflicts and contradictions, because that's usually where the most exciting close reading work comes up. It's much more interesting when you have something that doesn't quite fit and you try to work your way around it, rather than something that's like a perfect correlation. So I'm going to post this on YellowDig, so please comment with any questions you have, and be sure to use the @ symbol to tag me.